"Better stay seated, Grandpa." The words cracked across the drill field like a whip, followed by a burst of laughter from the young cadets. Dust swirled at their boots as they pointed toward the old man at the edge of the formation. One of them leaned forward, smirking as he added, "Don't break a hip trying to salute." The laughter grew, rising over the steady hum of cicadas and the metallic clink of gear in the hot sun. A few cadets elbowed each other, eyes bright with amusement at their own cruelty. To them, the man before them was nothing but a relic out of place, a shadow lingering where he did not belong. But the old man did not speak. His weathered hand tightened around the dented canteen at his side, the veins raised against paper-thin skin. He drew in a slow breath, his jaw locking, his shoulders stiffening with the unspoken discipline of decades. His boots, worn thin and cracked, shifted in the dust, but did not falter. Their laughter echoed louder, careless and cutting. But something else stirred at the far end of the field. A figure stood watching, eyes narrowed beneath the brim of a hat. The weight of his presence had not yet reached the cadets, but it was only a matter of time. For now, the old man bore the sting of mockery and silence. And then, everything changed. The sergeant had heard enough. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, please subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. The sun hung heavy over the drill academy, its heat pressing down with the weight of an anvil. The air shimmered above the blacktop, and the smell of scorched sand clung to the nostrils of every man standing in formation. Yet amid the fresh boots and crisp uniforms of youth, one figure stood apart, Thomas Keating, 76 years old, his presence both quiet and defiant. He was not there to be tested, not there to prove his body against time. He had been invited, though the cadets did not know it, to observe and share fragments of a hard-earned past. His role was one of legacy, a living witness meant to remind the younger generation of the blood-soaked roads that had been walked before them. But that purpose was hidden beneath the ridicule of those too young to recognize what they were mocking. Tom's hand brushed absently against his left knee, the joint stiff and stubborn, even after all these years. Beneath the fabric of his faded trousers lay scar tissue carved deep from a bayonet in Vietnam, a reminder not of weakness, but of survival. The pain never left, but he carried it as naturally as he carried his own shadow. He shifted his stance slightly, forcing the leg to bear his weight with the patience of discipline learned long ago. At his side rested a small, battered notebook. Its pages were filled with hand-drawn diagrams of tactical maneuvers, pencil lines etched with precision. Each line told a story of ambushes avoided, of men kept alive by a decision made in seconds, of missions endured under fire. To Tom, it was not a relic. It was memory made permanent. To the cadets, it was nothing more than an oddity, something to be scoffed at. The drill field around him pulsed with energy. Cadets shouted cadence as they marched, their voices rising in unison, every movement sharp and identical. The ground trembled faintly with their rhythm, a reminder of their youth and strength. Yet Tom's quiet stillness stood in contrast, like a lone tree weathering the wind while a storm raged around it. His dignity was not loud, but it was immovable. Tom's eyes scanned the field, sharp, despite the crow's feet carved at their corners. He noted posture, grip, the placement of feet during each maneuver. Old habits never left him. Once trained to evaluate, he always would. He carried no clipboard, no camera, only memory. His assessment was internal, measured not by regulations on paper, but by whether a soldier would survive in the field. The whispers began before the laughter. He caught them from the corner of his ear, cadets muttering as he shifted closer to observe. "What's he doing here?" one asked under his breath. Another snickered. "Probably thinks he's still in the fight." Their words were low, but Tom had learned in jungles long ago that even whispers travel. He chose not to respond. His silence was not weakness, it was control. He bent slowly to retrieve a pen he had dropped, fingers curling around it with care. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as though time itself had slowed for him. Behind him, a chuckle rose. A cadet muttered to another. Took him long enough. The two stifled laughter, unaware that each sound carried across the hot stillness like a crack of disrespect. Tom straightened, his spine stiff, his eyes fixed on the training ahead. The pen slid neatly back into the crease of his notebook. To him, the act was nothing more than order restored. To the cadets, it was another reason to sneer. They were too young to understand the patience of men who had endured nights under fire, when silence was the only defense, and time moved at the pace of survival. The field carried with it more than just heat and dust. It carried memory. For Tom, the rhythm of boots striking the ground stirred ghosts. He remembered his own cadence decades earlier, voices of comrades now long gone. He heard the faint echo of a drill sergeant from 1968, barking commands at boys who would soon be men, many of whom would never come home. He blinked once, the past folding into the present, and the sound of young cadets filled the void again. The mockery did not stop. One cadet walked past him deliberately close, brushing his shoulder with exaggerated swagger. "Didn't see you there, sir," he muttered with false courtesy. "Thought you were part of the dust." The others laughed at the remark, their voices bright and sharp, unaware of the lines they crossed. Tom's jaw tightened. His eyes stayed forward. Silence was his weapon. Silence, and the quiet endurance that had carried him through nights when fear clawed at his throat. He let their laughter hang in the air until it burned itself out, and then he shifted his weight again, his cane-thin legs steadying beneath him. Every motion carried the discipline of years, a man long accustomed to carrying weight no one else could see. The cadence resumed, louder now, the voices of youth drowning out the ridicule. Yet Tom's focus did not falter. He traced the form of each maneuver, his mind mapping the mistakes, noting the corrections that might save a life when real bullets replaced shouted commands. His presence was not for show. He was there for them, though they did not yet understand it. He turned a page in his notebook, the scratch of paper faint against the backdrop of boots and shouts. The diagrams there told of a jungle clearing, of a flanking maneuver executed in silence. His pencil had drawn it decades ago, but the memory was fresher than the ink. He had drawn it after returning home, needing to capture the moment before time could steal it from him. One cadet glanced at the notebook and smirked. "What's he got in there, treasure maps?" he whispered to his neighbor. The two chuckled, heads bent close, as if the man before them was invisible. Tom heard it, but his hand continued to hold the pencil with calm steadiness. He had faced worse than ridicule. He had stood against men who wished for his death. A laugh was nothing. The air shifted faintly. A breeze stirred the dust, lifting it into small whirls around their boots. Tom closed his eyes for half a moment, the grit brushing against his cheek, and the wind carried him back to a different place. He smelled jungle earth damp with blood, heard the distant whine of helicopters cutting through humid skies. The flash of memory lasted only seconds, but it left him standing straighter, as though the past had reinforced his spine. When he opened his eyes again, the cadets were still there, laughing, sneering, glancing at him with the careless superiority of youth. But Tom remained as he was, silent, firm, unshaken. The scars on his body were hidden beneath fabric, but the strength of his presence radiated for those who knew how to see it. Yet, among the laughter and whispers, no one stepped forward. No one offered a hand. No one rebuked the disrespect. The weight of their inaction hung heavier than the words themselves. It was not only the cruelty of the few that stung, it was the silence of the many. Tom exhaled slowly, his breath steady, his gaze still sharp. He had come here every year without incident, his role respected, if not understood. But this year was different. This year, they had crossed a line. The afternoon dragged on, the sun sinking lower but offering no relief. Heat clung to the field like a second skin, sweat rolling down the brows of cadets as they moved through their drills. Orders snapped through the air, crisp and sharp, cutting into the silence between stomping boots. Amid this rhythm, Tom shifted closer, positioning himself at the far edge of the group. He did not ask permission, did not intrude, only placed himself where he could watch. His movements were measured, deliberate, as though he understood he was a guest in someone else's house. His boots crunched against the gravel, each step slow but steady. Though his body bore the weight of time, his posture carried the remnants of discipline drilled into him long ago. He refused to hunch or stumble. Every stride was purposeful, every placement of his foot exact. To him, the act of simply walking across the drill yard was a declaration. He was still here, still whole, still capable of standing among soldiers. The cadets noticed. A ripple passed through their ranks, smirks exchanged, shoulders nudged. One whispered, "Look, the fossils joining in," and another stifled a laugh. Their faces turned away from the sergeant's gaze. They thought themselves clever, hidden behind youth, but their words traveled, sharp and distinct against the hard stillness of the field. Tom ignored them, his attention fixed on the exercise unfolding before him. He raised his chin slightly, studying the alignment of the cadets' stances. He had seen the maneuver countless times in his youth, but here, small flaws stood out. An arm too loose, a foot angled just wrong. His trained eye caught each imperfection, his mind adjusting it silently, as if speaking the correction in his thoughts might be enough to guide them. As he observed, his hand moved to his notebook once more. The pages opened with a gentle crackle, the pencil poised between his fingers. He began sketching, capturing the formation with a precision honed through decades of necessity. Each line was drawn with care, not for beauty but for clarity, for survival. His notes were not just marks on paper. They were the difference between men lost and men saved. One cadet noticed the act and snorted softly. "Look at him, drawing cartoons," he muttered to a friend. They both leaned closer, their whispers brimming with derision. "Maybe he's writing a diary. Dear Journal, today I survived standing up." The two stifled laughter again, trying not to attract attention, but their mockery cut through the air all the same. Tom's pencil never faltered. He kept his head bent, his expression calm, though his jaw remained tight. Silence was his answer, as it always had been. He had learned long ago that words could betray you, but composure was unbreakable armor. The exercise shifted, calling for a new formation. Cadets jogged across the yard, their boots pounding in rhythm, dust rising in thin clouds behind them. Tom moved again, stepping back to keep them in sight, his body slower but unwavering. His cane was not there to steady him. He refused it today. He relied only on the strength of scarred muscles and sheer willpower. As he walked, his left foot dragged slightly, the old wound in his knee stiffening with the effort. The sound was faint, a scrape against gravel, but it did not escape the notice of one cadet. A smirk tugged at the young man's mouth. "Listen," he whispered to his neighbor. "He sounds like he's dragging chains." The comment earned another round of quiet laughter, cruel and careless. Tom heard it. He said nothing. His pace did not change. His silence only seemed to fuel them more. When the cadets regrouped, Tom eased closer, standing just outside their circle. His eyes lingered on the smallest among them, a boy no older than 19 who struggled to keep pace with his peers. Tom remembered that struggle well. He had seen it in the eyes of young men thrown into jungles, expected to carry rifles heavier than their shoulders were ready for. For a moment, Tom's gaze softened. In the quiet of his heart, he willed the boy's strength, but the softness faded as another cadet deliberately brushed against him, shoulder striking hard enough to make Tom stagger a half step. The cadet muttered under his breath, "Careful there, old-timer. Don't fall and break something." Laughter flared again, louder this time, emboldened by the act. Tom's hand tightened on his notebook, but his face betrayed nothing. His silence was a wall, high and unyielding. The sergeant barked an order, pulling the cadets back into their line. Voices rose, sharp and disciplined once more. The mockery quieted under the weight of command, but the smirks lingered, glances thrown toward Tom when they thought no one else noticed. Their arrogance had not been extinguished, only paused. Tom adjusted his stance, his shoulders straight despite the ache running through his body. He looked over the group again, eyes narrowing. The drills were sloppy in ways the cadets could not yet recognize. A step out of sync here, a weapon held too loosely there. He wrote quickly, his pencil etching corrections into his notebook. His hand shook faintly, but his lines were steady, precise. The younger instructor caught sight of him writing and gave a brief nod of acknowledgement. There was no disrespect in the man's gaze, only quiet understanding. But he said nothing, perhaps unwilling to challenge the cadet's growing disdain. Tom noticed the nod, tucked it into his heart, and carried on. The drills ended, and the cadets broke into smaller groups. Water bottles passed, laughter bubbling again. One group eyed Tom openly now, their curiosity mingling with mockery. They leaned closer, their voices lower, but not low enough. "Why's he even here?" one asked. "What's he supposed to teach us? How to limp in formation?" Another chuckled at the remark, shaking his head in exaggerated disbelief. Tom turned a page in his notebook, his pencil moving again. He felt their eyes on him, felt the sting of their words, but he refused to look up. To meet their gaze would be to grant their disrespect power. His silence was not surrender. It was defiance carved from steel. Yet the atmosphere on the field had shifted. What began as whispers and sneers was now bold laughter, careless words spoken without fear of consequence. The cadets had crossed from curiosity into cruelty, and no one stepped in to stop them. The weight of that silence pressed heavier than the heat of the sun. Tom's grip tightened on his notebook, the paper crinkling slightly beneath his fingers. He stood taller, his face expressionless, but inside he knew the line had been crossed. Today would not pass quietly. The heat of the afternoon pressed heavier as the cadets shifted into their next exercise. Their sergeant's voice rang out, sharp and clipped, but behind the cadence there was another sound. Low chuckles, murmured insults, and the stifled laughter of those who believed themselves hidden from discipline. Tom remained where he was, his frame steady despite the weight of fatigue creeping through his bones. His hand rested on his notebook, the one object that had traveled with him more faithfully than any companion over the decades. As the cadets executed a maneuver, Tom saw it immediately, a flaw in their spacing, a mistake that would have cost lives in the chaos of combat. His pencil traced quickly across the page, sketching the adjustment, marking the correction with a firm line. His eyes narrowed as he worked, not in anger, but in the concentration of a craftsman who still believed in his duty. A voice cut through his focus, sharp with mockery. "Hey, let's ask him how to do it. Maybe he's got some ancient trick." The words were met with laughter, bold now, no longer hidden. The cadets turned their heads openly, their eyes fixed on Tom, as though his very presence were a joke. Tom lifted his head slowly, his eyes meeting theirs without flinching. He did not answer, only adjusted his stance, his body tall and unyielding against their taunts. His silence was heavier than any rebuke could have been, but the cadets mistook it for weakness. One of the louder voices rose above the rest. "Sure, let's do it his way. Maybe we should all crawl through the jungle with muskets too." The laughter exploded, the group emboldened by their own cruelty. The cadence of training faltered as more and more eyes turned toward Tom, the discipline of the field dissolving into mockery. Another cadet chimed in, smirking broadly. "Maybe he just misses his war. Poor guy probably thinks we're still fighting the cold one." The joke spread like fire, laughter building on laughter, until the sound rolled across the yard in waves. Tom's hand clenched faintly around his notebook. His knuckles whitened, the paper bending beneath his grip. He held it steady, refusing to let it shake, refusing to let them see the wound their words inflicted. His jaw was set like granite, his lips pressed into a thin line of discipline that no insult could break. Then came the act that crossed the line. A cadet, taller than the rest, swaggered toward him with false bravado. Without hesitation, he reached out and snatched the notebook from Tom's hands. The old paper rustled in the heat as it was ripped from its keeper's grasp, and a collective gasp flickered across the quieter corners of the field. The cadet flipped the notebook open, holding it high for others to see. "Look at this," he shouted, his voice filled with derision. "Hand-drawn drills. You really are a relic." His laughter rang loud, and others joined him, craning their necks to glimpse the pages that had carried decades of sacrifice and memory. The pages fluttered in the breeze, diagrams and notes exposed to the open sun. To the cadets, it was nothing but paper. To Tom, it was memory laid bare, the weight of lives carried in pencil lines, mocked as if it were a child's scribble. His chest tightened, but still he said nothing. His eyes followed the notebook, steady and unblinking, though his heart hammered with a mix of pain and resolve. Another cadet leaned over the shoulder of the one holding it. "These look like maps to a treasure hunt," he sneered. "What is this? A history lesson?" The others erupted in laughter, their voices cruel and careless, filling the yard with the sound of disrespect. A younger instructor, standing at the edge of the group, stepped forward hesitantly, his brow furrowed, his voice low but firm. "Enough. Hand it back." But the cadet only shrugged, grinning as he waved the notebook in the air. "We're just having fun, sir." The words dripped with mockery, their tone dismissive, emboldened by the crowd. The laughter swelled again, louder than the commands of discipline, drowning out the structure of the drill. What should have been a place of order had descended into ridicule, and all of it was centered on the man who stood silent, his dignity unbroken, but surrounded by cruelty. Tom's hands remained empty, but his eyes never left the notebook. He watched each page flutter, each laugh slice into memory, but his face betrayed no anger. His silence was his armor, though the weight of it pressed harder than any battlefield had. The cadet holding the notebook smirked wider, emboldened by Tom's restraint. "Come on, old man. Tell us how many dinosaurs you fought off with these tricks." The laughter peaked, shrill and merciless, echoing across the open yard. Tom's chest rose and fell in a slow, measured breath. He did not flinch. He did not reach. He simply stood, his posture straight, his eyes unyielding. The strength of his presence was not in words, not in retaliation, but in the immovable dignity that mocked them more deeply than any insult could. Yet not every eye in the yard was filled with cruelty. From the far side of the field, a figure had been watching, silent and still. His gaze was fixed on the scene, his jaw clenched, his body taut with quiet resolve. The cadets had not noticed him yet, but the old man's silence had not gone unseen. The laughter rolled on, but there was a change in the air, subtle yet undeniable. The presence of another weighed upon the scene, though the cadets remained blind to it. The field carried attention now, like the moment before a storm breaks, when the wind stills and the sky darkens, and everyone feels something they cannot yet name. Tom did not move. He did not speak. His silence was complete, but someone else had already decided enough was enough. The cadet's laughter still echoed as he flipped through the fragile pages of the notebook, holding it high above his head like a trophy. The paper curled in the dry air, edges brittle with age, yet every line upon them carried the weight of sacrifice. To the cadets, it was nothing more than a curiosity to mock. To Tom, it was memory laid bare, a ledger of survival written in graphite and sweat. For a moment, Tom did not move. He stood with his arms still at his sides, his chest rising and falling with steady restraint. The field buzzed with jeers, yet his silence pressed heavier than any shouted command. His eyes locked on the notebook, not with desperation, but with the fixed determination of a man who had endured worse humiliations in jungles half a world away. At last, Tom stepped forward. The gravel crunched softly beneath his boots, each step deliberate and unhurried. The cadet holding the notebook sneered, shaking it slightly as if to taunt him into speech. Tom did not falter. His hand extended, steady, the lines of his weathered palm a silent request. The cadet laughed again, lifting the notebook higher. "Oh, you want this back? What's it worth, old man?" His words drew another round of cruel amusement, the sound like knives scraping against stone. The group leaned in, eager for the confrontation, unaware of the quiet storm gathering in Tom's stance. Tom's hand remained outstretched, his gaze unwavering. No anger burned in his eyes, only the weight of unspoken memory. The silence stretched, long enough that even the laughter began to falter, cracks appearing in the arrogance of youth. Finally, with a scoff, the cadet slapped the notebook back into Tom's hand, muttering, "Fine, take your little scrapbook." The paper brushed against Tom's fingers, the familiar weight settling back where it belonged. He closed the cover carefully, his hands moving with reverence, as though restoring a wounded comrade to safety. His thumb pressed along the spine, smoothing the crease, sealing away the insults that had been thrown at it. For the first time since the mockery began, Tom lifted his head fully. His voice came low, steady, carrying not volume but gravity. "That technique you laughed at," he said, tapping a diagram with one calloused finger, "got 4 of my boys home. 1 didn't make it, but 4 did." The words fell heavy in the silence that followed. The laughter died instantly, caught in the throats of those who had been so eager to mock. The cadets shifted uneasily, their bravado faltering under the weight of something they had not expected. Truth spoken without boast, without bitterness, only fact. Tom lowered the notebook to his side, his grip gentle now, as though the memories inside had been defended with enough dignity. He did not elaborate, did not plead for understanding. His words had been given, and that was enough. For a heartbeat, the field seemed to still. The cicadas in the trees hummed louder, the sun pressing harder, as though the world itself paused to measure the weight of his statement. But then, from the back of the group, a cadet snorted. The sound broke the fragile silence like glass. "Yeah?" The cadet sneered, his voice filled with forced bravado. "Were dinosaurs still around back then?" The laughter sparked again, thinner now, but present all the same. It rose unevenly, more uncertain than before, but still sharp enough to pierce the air. Tom's eyes did not shift. He let the insult hang in the air, unanswered. Slowly, he turned and began to walk away, his boots pressing into the gravel with quiet finality. He did not hurry, did not stumble. His back remained straight, his posture unbroken. The cadets watched, some still smirking, others now quieter, unease creeping into their faces. They had mocked him, stripped at his dignity, yet he had not broken. His silence had spoken louder than their cruelty, his words heavier than their laughter. He had held the line. As Tom walked, the notebook pressed against his side, his hand firm upon it. His movements carried the precision of habit. He adjusted his pace with the discipline of decades, each step a reflection of training that had never left him. Even in retreat, he carried himself as a soldier. Behind him the laughter thinned, less certain now, the sound weaker without the full conviction of cruelty. A few cadets exchanged glances, discomfort flickering across their youthful arrogance. They had expected him to crumble, to fight, to lash out. Instead, he had given them something far heavier, his truth, spoken once, left to echo in their silence. Tom reached the edge of the field and paused, turning slightly to watch the drills continue. His face remained unreadable, his eyes sharp, his silence unbroken. The pain of the insult lingered, but he bore it as he had borne everything else, with quiet endurance. Unseen by the cadets, another figure had been watching from the far side of the field. Sergeant Morales stood rigid, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable as his gaze followed every movement. He had seen the mockery, heard every word, witnessed the strength of silence that carried more weight than any rebuke. Tom's silence had not gone unnoticed. The sergeant's jaw clenched, his boots shifting in the dust. The decision forming in his mind was heavy, final, and when it came, it would change everything. The last echoes of laughter hung weakly over the drill yard, scattered and uneven, as though even the cadets themselves were no longer certain of their own cruelty. Tom stood at the edge of the field, his back straight, his hand resting firmly on the worn cover of his notebook. His silence radiated across the open space, an invisible wall that none of their words had pierced. Across the field, Sergeant Morales had watched everything. His eyes, dark and steady, had tracked each insult, each laugh, each movement of the man they mocked. He had remained silent, his posture unyielding, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He had not needed to speak yet. His presence alone carried the authority of battle-tested experience. Morales was not a man given to theatrics. His years in Afghanistan had stripped him of unnecessary gestures. He knew the value of silence, the power of a pause before a command. Now that silence had become heavier than the cadets realized. It weighed upon him like a decision waiting to be spoken, a judgment gathering strength. The air thickened as Morales shifted his stance. His boots pressed into the gravel with a slow, deliberate grind, a sound faint but undeniable. Some cadets glanced toward him instinctively, their laughter faltering mid-breath. A ripple of unease passed through the ranks, though no order had yet been given. Tom did not turn. He remained where he was, his gaze fixed on the drills, as if the insults and laughter had never reached him. His silence was not ignorance, it was discipline, but Morales knew the weight of that silence. He recognized it for what it was, the unshakable restraint of a man who had carried pain far greater than mockery. The cadets shuffled slightly, their earlier boldness softening under the awareness of their sergeant's presence. But the silence stretched, unbroken, as Morales let the weight of the moment settle. His eyes swept across the group, landing briefly on the cadet who had snatched the notebook. The young man shifted uneasily, his smirk fading beneath the pressure of that gaze. At last, Morales stepped forward. The sound of his boots striking the gravel was like a drumbeat, steady and final. Each stride closed the distance between himself and the group, and with every step, the cadets' confidence shrank further. No one spoke now. The silence grew thick, pressing against their chests. When Morales stopped, he stood not in front of Tom, but beside him. The positioning was deliberate, a silent declaration. He did not shield the old man, did not place himself as protector, but aligned himself shoulder to shoulder. The cadets saw it instantly, though no words had been spoken. Respect was being given. His eyes swept the formation once more, cold and precise. His jaw tightened as he drew in a breath, and then his voice cut through the stillness like a blade. Front and center. Now. The command cracked across the yard, sharp as thunder. The cadets flinched, boots scrambling to obey. The line snapped into place, though it was ragged, their earlier arrogance shattered by the weight of the order. Dust swirled around their ankles as they stood at attention, eyes forward but hearts uneasy. They knew instinctively that something had shifted, though they could not yet name it. Morales let the silence return after his command. He did not rush his words, did not spill them in anger. He allowed the weight of the moment to settle, each second dragging like an eternity. His eyes swept them again, pausing on each face, pinning them beneath the force of his stare. Behind the silence, the cicadas droned louder, the hum of summer pressing against the edges of their discipline. Sweat trickled down temples, boots shifted faintly, but no one dared to move. The stillness was suffocating, as though the very air had thickened with expectation. Tom remained motionless, his notebook tucked firmly beneath his arm. He had not asked for defense, had not sought rescue, yet here stood Morales, not as savior, but as witness. Their silence together carried more strength than the laughter of the entire field. The cadets, once bold, now stood stripped of their bravado. Their eyes darted between Morales and the old man, realizing belatedly that the scene they had mocked was not invisible. Every word, every insult, every laugh had been heard. Their confidence, so strong moments before, now wavered under the weight of exposure. Morales shifted his weight once more, his stance grounded, immovable. His voice came again, quieter this time but sharper, each word honed like steel. You thought you were clever. You thought you were bold. But all I see are children who have forgotten what it means to wear this uniform. The words cut deeper than shouting ever could. The cadets stiffened, faces flushing with shame. their pride unraveling in silence. They had expected mockery to go unchallenged. Instead, they found themselves under the harshest gaze of all, one that demanded respect not just for authority but for history itself. Morales turned his head slightly, glancing at Tom. The gesture was subtle, a fraction of movement, but it carried a message. The time for silence had ended. Recognition was about to begin. The cadets held their breath, their hearts pounding as they waited for the next words. Morales had given many commands in his career, but what he was about to say now would be unlike any other. And then, with the full authority of his presence pressing down on every soul in that yard, he spoke 4 words that would change everything. Listen to this man. The words hung in the air like a bell toll, final and unshakable. Morales's voice carried no flourish, no theatrics. It was flat, heavy, absolute. The order struck the cadets harder than any punishment drill, harder than any shouted rebuke. Silence followed instantly, a silence so deep it pressed against their ears, leaving them suddenly aware of every heartbeat, every breath. The cadets stood frozen in formation, their posture stiff, their expressions uncertain. The smirks that had once curled their lips were gone, replaced with the dull weight of realization. None dared to laugh now. None dared to move. Morales's command was not a suggestion. It was law. Tom shifted slightly, his boots grinding softly against the gravel. His gaze moved from Morales to the young faces before him. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy as iron, and the cadets fidgeted under its weight. Some lowered their eyes. Others swallowed hard, waiting. Morales did not speak again. He stood beside Tom, his presence immovable, his expression unreadable. The decision had been made, and there was no turning back. He had placed the authority of the entire yard into the hands of the man they had mocked. Tom's hand rested on the cover of his notebook, his thumb brushing absently against the worn spine. He drew in a slow breath, steadying himself, not out of nerves but out of habit. He had never asked for this moment. He had not come to speak, to lecture, or to prove himself. Yet here he stood, with the eyes of the young fixed upon him, waiting to hear words they did not yet know they needed. The cicadas hummed louder in the heat, a droning chorus that filled the edges of the silence. The dust swirled faintly in the breeze, settling against the leather of boots, the fabric of uniforms. Everything about the yard seemed to pause, as though the world itself leaned closer to hear what would come. Finally, Tom lifted his head. His eyes, sharp despite the years etched into them, swept across the faces before him. He saw arrogance still clinging to some, shame flickering in others, uncertainty in most. What he did not see was understanding. That would come only with time, only with words that carried the weight of memory. His voice, when it came, was not loud. It was low, steady, and firm, carrying not with volume, but with gravity. "You think these pages are worthless," he said, lifting the notebook slightly. "You think the lines inside are relics, old stories with no place here. But these pages are the reason some men lived. These pages are the reason I stand here now." The cadets did not move. Their eyes followed the notebook, their ears straining to catch every word. The laughter that had filled the air only minutes ago seemed unthinkable now, replaced by a silence so sharp it cut deeper than any command. Tom turned the notebook over in his hands, his fingers brushing across the frayed corners. His eyes grew distant for a moment, as though he were no longer standing on the drill field, but somewhere else, far away, long ago. His jaw tightened, and then he spoke again. 4 boys went home because of what's in here. 1 didn't, but 4 did, and that's what mattered. The weight of the words sank into the cadets like stones into water. They shifted slightly, their chests tightening with something they did not yet understand. For the first time, some of them saw not just an old man, but a soldier who had carried the weight of decisions they had never faced. Tom's voice wavered slightly, not from weakness, but from the heaviness of memory pressing against him. He steadied it with a breath, his shoulders squaring, his gaze sharpening again. He would not falter here. Not now. From the corner of the yard, the younger instructor stood silent, his eyes fixed on Tom. Respect glimmered faintly across his expression, though he did not move to speak. This was not his moment to claim. It belonged solely to the man the cadets had mocked. The cadet who had stolen the notebook earlier swallowed hard, his smirk long gone. His face had paled, his hands clenched tightly at his sides. He could not meet Tom's eyes. The weight of guilt pressed against him, though no accusation had been spoken. Tom's hand lowered slowly, the notebook once again resting against his side. He did not embellish, did not boast. His words had been given, and now they belonged to the air, carried by silence heavier than any reprimand. He did not need to explain further. He had spoken the truth, and that was enough. The yard remained still, the cadets frozen in formation. Even the breeze seemed to hesitate, carrying the smell of dust and sweat, but not daring to disturb the weight of the moment. Morales's eyes moved across the group, sharp and watchful, but he did not speak. He knew the silence was the lesson. Tom's gaze shifted once more across the young faces. He saw himself in them, decades earlier, full of fire, full of arrogance, full of the belief that time could never touch them. He had once stood where they stood, laughing at the unknown, blind to the price that would one day be demanded. His silence now was not judgment, but memory. Then Morales's hand moved, slow and deliberate, coming to rest firmly on Tom's shoulder. The gesture was not dramatic, not performed for effect. It was simple, respectful, final. In that touch was acknowledgement, gratitude, and the quiet recognition of brotherhood. The cadets stared, their hearts pounding, their throats dry. They had not expected this. They had not expected to see their sergeant stand in line with the man they had mocked. The weight of their actions crashed down on them, stripping away the last threads of their arrogance. No one laughed now. No one dared to speak. The yard had transformed into something else entirely. A place not of drills and commands, but of memory and respect. And it had all begun with 4 words that had shattered their bravado. Listen to this man. The yard was still, the command of silence heavier than any drill they had ever endured. Tom stood with his notebook pressed against his side, Sergeant Morales's hand resting firmly on his shoulder. For a long moment, no one moved. The cadets waited, their lungs tight, their hearts uneasy. The weight of expectation pressed upon them like the heat of the sun. Tom's eyes drifted past them, past the field, past the barracks. He was not looking at the cadets anymore. His gaze had gone distant, reaching back across decades. His lips parted slightly, and when he spoke, his words came slower, as though pulled from a place he rarely allowed himself to revisit. "We were deep in the jungle," he began, his voice quiet but unwavering. "Vietnam, recon unit, 6 of us." His eyes narrowed slightly, the details returning with clarity sharpened by memory. The air was so thick you could hardly breathe. Every leaf carried water, every step sank into mud. You learned to walk without sound, or you didn't walk again. The cadets leaned in almost imperceptibly. None dared to move closer, but their bodies tilted, their ears strained. They had mocked him minutes before, but now his words held them fast, drawing them into a world they had never known. Tom shifted the notebook in his hand, opening it slowly. He turned to a page where faded pencil lines traced the outline of a clearing. His finger tapped the markings. This was the day we were spotted. We should have been dead. They had the numbers, the position, the high ground. But we used this pattern, crawled through the mud, waited for the signal, moved when the rain hit. 4 of us made it home because of this. The cadets stared at the page, their eyes tracing the lines that had once seemed laughable. Now the diagrams were no longer relics, no longer a joke. They were survival itself, etched into paper when blood had still been fresh on the ground. Tom closed the notebook again, his hand trembling faintly as he did. His voice dropped lower. the weight of loss pressing against every syllable. One didn't make it. His name was Walker, 19, same age as some of you standing here. He paused, his jaw tightening, his eyes wet with memory, though no tears fell. He took the bullet meant for me. We carried him out so his mother wouldn't wonder forever. The field was silent. The cadets' throats tightened, their earlier arrogance dissolving into shame. Some lowered their eyes, unable to meet his gaze. Others stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes, seeing not an old man, but the living proof of sacrifice. Tom's chest rose with a sharp breath, and for a moment his voice faltered. He steadied it with the discipline of years, pressing forward with the truth they needed to hear. You think time takes strength from a man. You think scars are weakness, but scars are just the proof that you endured. And endurance, his voice grew firmer, is the only reason any of us stand here. Sergeant Morales remained silent, his hand still upon Tom's shoulder. His eyes never left the cadets, but his silence was no longer cold. It was reverent. He allowed the weight of Tom's words to press upon them without interruption, knowing that nothing he could say would carry the same force. One cadet, the loudest mocker, shifted uneasily. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, the flush of shame creeping up his neck. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, though the tension was not anger, it was regret. He could not lift his eyes to meet Tom's. Tom did not look at him specifically. His gaze swept the group as a whole, taking in every face, every expression. He spoke not to shame but to teach, his voice steady, carrying the cadence of memory rather than reproach. You laugh at what you don't understand. I know. I was your age once. I laughed at the men who came before me, until the day I needed every lesson they gave me, and the laughter turned to silence. The cadets stood rooted, their bodies rigid in formation, but their minds shifting, reshaping. What had begun as mockery was becoming something else, something heavier. They had been called to listen, and now they were bound by the gravity of what they heard. Tom lowered the notebook slowly, letting his arm rest again at his side. His shoulders sagged faintly, the effort of memory pressing down on him, but his stance remained tall. He had given them his truth, a fragment of memory that cost him more than they could know. The silence after his words was thicker than before. No one dared to break it. The only sounds were the distant drone of insects and the faint creak of leather as Morales shifted his grip on his belt. The yard had transformed, the atmosphere unrecognizable from the arrogance and laughter that had filled it only moments earlier. Tom's gaze finally settled, not on the cadets but on the horizon beyond them. His eyes were distant still, fixed on ghosts they could not see. For a moment, it seemed as if he stood among two worlds, the present field of youth and discipline, and the past field of mud, blood, and sacrifice. Then Morales' hand tightened on his shoulder, grounding him. Their eyes met briefly, the quiet acknowledgement of men who had lived through different wars but carried the same scars. No words passed between them. None were needed. The cadets saw it, the wordless bond, the unspoken recognition between two soldiers of different generations. It was a language they had not yet learned, but one day they might. For now, they only witnessed it, and in witnessing, they began to understand. And then, Morales drew in a slow breath, preparing to speak again. The cadets braced themselves, knowing instinctively that what he was about to say would leave no room for arrogance, no space for laughter. The silence of the yard lingered, pressing against every uniform, every bowed head. The weight of Tom's words still hung heavy, like smoke that refused to clear. Sergeant Morales remained beside him, the grip of his hand still firm upon the old man's shoulder. For a moment longer, he said nothing, letting the cadets sit in the discomfort of what they had just heard. Finally, Morales drew a breath, his chest rising slowly, his expression still hard, but his eyes carrying something deeper. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than the cadets expected. It was not the bark of command, but something heavier, something etched with memory. I was 12 years old when I first saw your name. The cadets shifted uneasily, Their eyes flicked between Morales and Tom, uncertain of where the words were leading. The sergeant's voice had lost none of its authority, but it carried a tone that was rare, almost reverent. Morales continued, his gaze still locked on the cadets. It was in the paper. Silver Star. Operation Iron Wind. He paused, the name itself enough to darken the silence further. His jaw tightened as his eyes drifted briefly to Tom. My brother was in that operation. He didn't come back. The cadets' faces paled, the weight of his words slamming into them like a hammer. A ripple of realization moved through the group. They had mocked a man whose name was carved into the memory of their own sergeant, a man tied to the bloodline of their leader's past. Morales's voice dropped lower, the cadence deliberate, each word sinking deeper. You brought his body home. You carried him when no one else could. You put him in the ground with dignity, so my family didn't have to wonder forever. His throat worked as he swallowed, but his voice did not waver. I never forgot. Tom's eyes closed briefly, his head bowing slightly at the weight of memory. His lips pressed together, and he gave the faintest nod. It was not pride in what he had done, but acknowledgement of the pain that still lingered. The cadets stood frozen. Their earlier arrogance had been stripped entirely away. Their sergeant was not merely defending a veteran out of formality. He was standing beside the very man who had carried his own brother's body from the battlefield. The revelation struck like lightning, sudden and irrevocable. The cadet who had mocked the loudest felt his chest seize. His throat tightened, his mouth dry as sand. His hands trembled faintly at his sides. He had laughed at a man who had delivered another soldier home, who had lived through hell so that others could at least rest in peace. His eyes dropped to the dirt, shame crashing down upon him like a weight he could not carry. Tom lifted his gaze once more, his eyes settling on the cadets. His voice was steady again, calm but sharp. You don't need to be sorry for not knowing. You need to remember. His words were not condemnation but instruction, not bitterness, but truth. The lesson was not for guilt, it was for reverence. The cadets shifted, their boots grinding faintly in the gravel. One by one their eyes lowered, not by order, but by instinct. The silence was no longer the silence of arrogance, but the silence of recognition. They were seeing him now, not as an old man, not as a relic, but as a soldier whose past was carved into their own present. Morales turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping across the formation. His voice hardened again, returning to the tone of command, though the reverence still lingered beneath it. Every one of you stands here because of men like him, men who endured when there was nothing left to endure, men who carried each other so you would have the chance to wear this uniform. The weight of the words crushed the last fragments of bravado. Shoulders sagged, jaws clenched, eyes burned with the sting of shame. No cadet dared to speak. No cadet dared to move. The field had become a place of judgment, and the verdict was undeniable. Tom stood taller now, his silence more powerful than ever. The notebook pressed against his side seemed less a fragile object and more a living artifact, a vessel of history that had survived alongside him. He had been mocked for it, yet now it stood as proof, undeniable and unshakable. The cadet who had seized the notebook earlier took a half-step forward, his breath shaking. His voice cracked as he forced words past his dry throat. I didn't know. His eyes burned, his shame raw, his arrogance gone. I'm sorry. Tom regarded him quietly. His expression remained unreadable, his eyes calm. His voice, when it came, was steady, almost gentle. You don't need to be sorry. You need to listen. You need to carry it forward. So the next time you see a man with scars, you don't see weakness. You see the reason you're standing free. The cadet's chin trembled as he bowed his head, unable to respond. The silence stretched long, but no one broke it. The lesson had been given, and it would not be forgotten. Morales exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering, as if a long-held burden had finally been released. His hand still rested firmly on Tom's shoulder, the bond between them unshaken, forged anew in the presence of those who had witnessed it. The cadets looked on, their expressions no longer mocking, no longer arrogant. Their eyes were filled now with something else, something heavier, quieter, respect. And then Morales straightened once more, his voice returning to the tone of authority. His eyes swept the field, sharp and unrelenting. From this day forward, things will not be the same. The weight of the moment pressed over the field like a storm cloud, heavy and immovable. Every cadet stood locked in formation, their spines rigid but their hearts unsettled. The words they had heard, the revelations laid bare, had stripped away their youthful arrogance. No one dared to smirk now. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The silence was complete, the kind of silence that precedes something irrevocable. Sergeant Morales let it linger a few breaths longer. His eyes moved slowly across the line of cadets, studying each face, each expression. He saw shame in some, regret in others, but most of all he saw the dawning of something new, recognition. It was the seed of respect, fragile but undeniable, and he intended to see it grow. At last, Morales's voice rang out, not in anger, but in measured command. From this day forward, every final drill at this academy will include a legacy witness. His words cut across the silence like a steady blade. The cadets stiffened, absorbing the order. You will not just train against time and sweat. You will train in the presence of those who wore this uniform before you. Men who endured the fire so you would have the chance to march on this field. A ripple moved through the cadets, not spoken, but felt. The order was not temporary. It was permanent. Their mockery had birthed a new tradition, one that would outlive them all. Morales's eyes swept over them again, sharper now. His voice rose, filled with the steel of authority. And if I ever hear one more laugh, one more insult, one more word of disrespect toward age, scars, or memory, he paused, letting the weight hang in the hot air. You will answer to me, directly. The words landed heavy. A few cadets shifted uncomfortably, their throats dry, their earlier bravado stripped to nothing. The lesson was no longer abstract. It had become an unshakable rule carved into the fabric of their training. Morales reached out, lifting Tom's notebook from his side with careful respect. He held it up, high enough for every cadet to see. The pencil lines, the faded paper, the worn cover. It was no longer a subject of ridicule. In that moment, it became something greater. This, Morales declared, is no relic. This is no scrapbook. This is a resource. This is survival written in lead. The cadets' eyes followed the notebook, their earlier laughter now a source of shame that burned hotter than the sun overhead. Morales lowered it slowly, pressing it back into Tom's hands, the gesture deliberate, reverent, final. Tom closed his fingers over the notebook, the familiar weight returning to its rightful place. His eyes did not seek the cadets, did not seek validation. He simply held it as he always had, the silent keeper of memories too heavy to be spoken often. His silence, once mocked, was now understood. The transformation was subtle but undeniable. A cadet from the back of the formation, without being told, stepped forward and offered Tom his canteen of water. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of acknowledgement. Another cadet, chest tight with regret, raised his hand in a crisp salute. One by one, others followed, their arms snapping up with precision, their faces solemn. Tom did not seek their salutes. He had never asked for recognition. But as he returned a slow, steady nod, the field seemed to exhale, the air shifting from shame to something heavier, purer. Respect had been born in silence and sealed in action. Morales allowed the moment to linger. He said nothing as the salutes held, his eyes sweeping the field, watching the cadets transform before him. When he finally spoke again, his words were softer, but no less powerful. This academy is built on sweat, but today you learned it must also be built on memory. The cadets lowered their arms, their faces still solemn. None spoke. None dared to diminish the gravity of what had just occurred. They had been rebuked, transformed, and bound to a new tradition. Tom lowered himself onto the wooden bench at the edge of the field, his movements careful but steady. This time, no one mocked the act. No laughter followed. The same cadet who had offered water now stepped forward again, placing the canteen gently on the bench beside him. Others remained standing nearby, not out of pity, but out of quiet deference. For the first time that day, Tom allowed himself to rest. His hand remained on the notebook, his thumb brushing the spine. But his gaze was no longer filled with the weight of defense. It was calm now, steady, watchful. He had given them what he could. The rest was for them to carry forward. Sergeant Morales stood at attention, his gaze fixed firmly on the horizon. He did not look at Tom, did not look at the cadets. His silence was its own command. The moment was not to be broken. The field that had begun the day with mockery now stood transformed, reshaped by truth and memory. The cadets had laughed, they had mocked, but now they stood in the presence of history, humbled and changed. And though the sun still beat down, the weight that pressed upon them was no longer the heat of the day. It was the weight of understanding, the kind that does not lift, the kind that shapes men into something greater. A week passed, and the drill yard greeted another morning beneath the same unrelenting sun. The cadence of boots striking gravel echoed once more, sharp and steady, filling the air with rhythm and discipline. Yet something in the atmosphere had changed. The field no longer carried the same edge of careless laughter. It carried memory now, weightier than any shouted command. On the sideline, a wooden chair had been placed carefully, its legs pressed firm into the dust. Upon the back of the chair hung a simple nameplate, hammered in with care. Keating Post, Legacy Watch. It bore no flourish, no decoration, only the quiet permanence of respect. The cadets had placed it there themselves. Tom Keating sat in the chair, his posture upright despite the aches of age. His hands rested on his lap, the notebook tucked safely at his side. He did not seek attention, did not demand acknowledgement, yet his presence carried across the yard like a silent banner. The cadets felt his eyes upon them, and they moved sharper, straighter, cleaner. The drills unfolded with their usual rigor, but when mistakes came, the cadets corrected them quickly, glancing toward the man on the sideline. They no longer dismissed his age. They no longer smirked at his scars. His silence had become its own form of instruction, heavier than any shouted correction. During a pause in training, a young cadet jogged to the edge of the field. He carried a steaming cup of coffee, the rim trembling slightly in his nervous hands. Without a word, he placed it on the bench beside Tom, nodding once before hurrying back into formation. The gesture was small, but it carried the weight of reverence. Tom lifted the cup, the warmth pressing into his palms. He sipped slowly, his eyes fixed on the cadets as they returned to drill. The bitterness of the coffee grounded him, carrying him back to memories of other mornings when men had gathered around tin cups before facing the fire. For the first time in many years, he felt that old bond return, not with his peers, but with the young who would carry the torch forward. The cadet who had mocked the loudest a week before now moved with the sharpest precision. His face was solemn, his eyes steady. When his gaze met Tom's across the yard, he did not look away. Instead, he raised his hand in a silent salute, crisp and unwavering. Tom returned the nod, his expression unreadable, but his heart steadied by the gesture. The rest of the formation followed, their movements sharpened by the knowledge that they were no longer performing for themselves alone. They were performing in the presence of a man who embodied the weight of history. Each shout of cadence carried less arrogance and more reverence, the rhythm driven by respect as much as discipline. At the edge of the yard, Sergeant Morales stood with his arms crossed, his gaze hard, but his eyes glinting with something quieter. He did not need to speak. He had already set the order, already carved the tradition into the bones of the academy. Now he simply watched, ensuring that the silence of respect never faded again. Tom's presence had become ritual. He came each morning, took his place at the chair and said little. The cadets, in turn, moved sharper. saluted more firmly, and listened more closely. The lessons he had given with only a handful of words now echoed across every movement they made. The once loud cadet found himself drawn back during breaks, asking quiet questions. At first, Tom answered briefly, sparingly, but as the days passed, his words stretched further, weaving fragments of history into the present. The cadet listened, his arrogance gone, his heart open. He had learned to respect by first learning to be humbled. Other cadets followed, coming in pairs or small groups, sitting at the edge of the bench, their voices quieter than usual. They did not ask about medals or victories. They asked about survival. They asked about endurance. They asked what it meant to carry scars and keep walking. Tom answered not as a lecturer, but as a witness, giving them fragments they could carry into their own lives. The academy had changed. The drills were no longer only about endurance of the body, but endurance of memory. The presence of Tom Keating reminded them daily that tradition was not ink on paper or words in a manual. It was living, breathing, scarred, and silent, sitting in a chair on the sideline, watching them with steady eyes. As the sun sank lower, shadows stretched across the yard. The cadence calls faded into the distance, the drills ending with the final sharp stomp of boots. The cadets stood in formation one last time, their bodies glistening with sweat, their faces solemn. Tom rose slowly from his chair, his hand pressing against the wooden armrest for balance. The notebook remained tucked at his side. He stepped forward once, his movement steady despite the weight of years. The cadets snapped their arms into a crisp salute, the line of hands rising in perfect unison. For a long moment, Tom stood before them, his face calm, his eyes steady. He returned a slow, measured nod, his silence louder than any speech. The salutes held, unwavering, until he turned back toward his chair. Only then did their arms lower, the respect complete. Sergeant Morales exhaled quietly, his arms still crossed, his gaze fixed on the old man's retreating figure. He knew this was more than ritual now. This was tradition born before their eyes, forged in humiliation but sealed in respect. As the last light of the day painted the yard in gold, Tom Keating sat once more, the notebook safe in his lap, the cadets dispersing with quiet reverence. No one mocked, no one whispered. The lesson had been carved into them, unshakable and enduring. The academy would carry it forward. And as long as Tom sat in that chair, the legacy of those who had endured before would never be forgotten. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you're watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.